And we have another question that came in via text, and it reads, are there limitations to sexual acts in a Christian marriage? Now, what does the Bible tell us about sexual acts in a Christian marriage? Are there limitations, or is it just a free-for-all?
Well, I think the Bible does teach there are limitations. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4 really is a defining verse that helps us understand. There in Hebrews 13:4, the Bible says this, marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge. Now, some people will quote that very text and say, well, in marriage anything goes. However, the Bible itself defines very clearly. The word there, defiled, is literally translated uncontaminated, and it's often used to reference Jesus and his sinlessness and his sinless life. And then it also says that it is honorable, literally translated to be precious, to be dear, to be held in respect. And so then it is in that context that we answer the question. Well, Paul, here in Hebrews 13, answers right away and says, not everything is acceptable. Adultery, not acceptable in the marriage relationship, because the Bible defines marriage as between one man, one woman, and that bond is a bond that's never to be broken apart by any human being. And so any outside source is outside the bounds of God's will. Secondly, fornication. What is fornication? Fornication is having loose or illicit relationships outside of the marriage covenant. And then how do we practically apply this? There are other clear principles that Jesus gives. Jesus gives the principle in Matthew 5:28 that if we look upon a woman with lust in our heart, it is an adulterous situation. So that would automatically eliminate pornography and these kinds of things from the marriage covenant. And there's more that could be said, but there are some clear principles that the marriage covenant is between two people who love one another and have a covenantal love, which a covenantal love gives the ability to say yes and to say no. And so it is in that context and in those principles that no, not everything is a free-for-all, as you had said, but there are certain principles to give a loving relationship in the marriage context.
Dr. Brown.
I would add the word mutuality.
Yes.
That in marriage, it's not about what I want. It is about respecting what our spouse wants. And Paul does speak about it in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. It's a wonderful chapter that he speaks both to singles and to marrieds in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. But with regards to our question in marriage, it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 3, let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. And then in verse 5, it says this, do not deprive one another except with consent for a time. In other words, you must regard the desires of your spouse and vice versa. Sexual acts within marriage are reciprocal. They're not selfish. They're about my spouse's joy, and I gain joy and pleasure from bringing joy and pleasure to my spouse. That's Christian marriage.